Aloha and welcome to Line in the Sand. I'm Christy Martin and I'll be your host. Today we're going to be talking about biofouling, an issue that is impacting our reefs across the state. And with us today we have four panelists that are going to help us understand about biofouling. And with us we have Brian Nielsen. He's the Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator with the Division of Aquatic Resources, Department of Land and Natural Resources. We also have with us Scott Godwin. He's the he's head of resource protection for Papahanaumokuakea Marine National Monument, that's NOAA. We also have Kevin Richardson. He is a legal fellow with the Coordinating Group on Alien Pest Species. And we have Jules Kuo, also with Division of Aquatic Resources. She is the Ballast and Biofouling Coordinator. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you so much for being here. You know, biofouling is something that we don't talk often about. In fact, this may be the first time you're hearing about it. Biofouling in general are the marine species that are riding on the outsides of vessels. And when vessels come here, they can escape off the hulls and infest our reefs. But we're going to take a big look at our reefs for now and talk a little bit about the marine environment in Hawaii. And to help us set the stage just a bit, we're going to ask Brian Nielsen to go over some general invasive aquatic species and the issue in Hawaii.
So when we're talking about marine environments in Hawaii, we're really talking about a whole range of different habitats. And that also includes our freshwater environments as well that are also impacted by invasive species. Just to go through a few of these habitats, we have our marine habitats that we're all familiar with, our nearshore areas, our coral reefs, and they're heavily inundated by invasive species, fish like the roi, the toau, the taope, but also seaweed or invasive algae, and also a wide variety of invasive invertebrates. We also have our estuary systems. These are the areas where the streams meet the ocean, and these are important nursery grounds for our native fisheries, but also heavily impacted by native species.
Invasive species.
Invasive species. And so some of our estuaries have up to 50% of the biomass of juvenile fish are actually invasive. So this is a big problem for our native fisheries. And it's not just the fish, our shorelines are impacted as well with California grass and mangroves in these areas. We also have our anchuline pools. These are the very special areas in the nearshore environment, the brackish water pools that are home to a variety of native shrimps and gobies, also heavily impacted by invasive tilapia, Tahitian prawns, and a variety of guppies. We also have our rivers, streams, and lakes. Not marine environments, but also heavily impacted by invasive species. Some streams, up to 80% of the biomass, can have invasive fish. So just to kind of wrap up what we're dealing with in terms of invasive species in these environments, we have over 20 species of marine fish, over 40 species of freshwater invasives. For invertebrates, over 200 species. And for aquatic plants, 28 species. Invasive seaweed or algae, over 14 species. And that gives us a grand total of over 300 species. So we're kind of in a triage mode here for managing invasive species. And the best we can do is kind of pick the biggest threat species and focus our management efforts on those, but we can also look at prevention and try to keep this number from going up in the future.
Yeah, well, as the invasive species coordinator for aquatics, you've got quite a large job, and I understand a lot of triage goes on. So when you talk about prevention, what is the Division of Aquatic Resources, what are the priorities there for prevention?
So prevention, we look at in terms of setting rules and regulations to make sure that there's permits and a legal system to keep these invasives from coming into Hawaii in the first place. Also in terms of prevention is working with all the people here in Hawaii that are out in the water on a daily basis to keep us informed when they do see something that they don't recognize, to let us know so we can get out there as quick as possible and try to control or eradicate it before it really takes hold.
And so also, you know, when you think about prevention, the issues, you're really trying to guess what's coming up next, and how do you prioritize that work?
Yeah, that's a really tough job to try to guess what's going to come into the island next. So we have to use the best available science, extensive monitoring, and then kind of identify what are the main vector pathways, what's the main way that these non-native species are getting into Hawaii, and then focus our prevention efforts there.
Well, what are some of the ways that these species are getting in? I mean, you have a long list of different types of creatures coming in. I noticed that it was very heavy on invertebrates and seaweeds in particular. What are some ways that things are getting into Hawaii?
So the number one source of invasive or non-native species coming into Hawaii is the shipping industry. And although it's our lifeline here in Hawaii, it's also the number one source of introduced species. So that is a major target of our prevention efforts.
Thanks very much. So we are going to take a short break. When we come back, we're going to learn a little bit more about the impacts of these new species in our environment. Stay tuned. You're watching Line in the Sand. Thank you for staying with us. You're watching Line in the Sand. We're learning about marine invasive species. And so, Brian, can you tell us, you know, what's the problem with new species in the environment? You know, some people are of the opinion that if it's here, we should just accept it and move on. Can you describe a little bit about the impacts?
So new species can have major impacts on our marine environment. In our marine environments or any marine environment, they're not adapted to the introduced species, so there's kind of an unfair advantage. So these introduced species can really dominate and take over the native community. An example of that is invasive seaweed. This is one of the major threats in Hawaii, and has been brought over through biofouling, aquaculture, and ballast water, and has really wreaked havoc on some of our reefs. One example are the species Capophycus euchaema, also known as smothering seaweed. This seaweed was introduced to Kaneohe Bay back in the 1970s, and it overgrows coral reefs and eventually kills corals. As you can see from the photo, it's capable of blanketing a whole coral colony and eventually smothering it. You can see from this photo that the coral colony has begun to die from where the algae was removed. And then a little bit later stages of invasion, the algae is removed and the coral is almost completely dead beneath that invasive algae. And as a result, the state, along with our partners, have been working to try to remove the invasive algae from the reefs in Kaneohe Bay. And we do this as a two-part project. First, we go in, mechanically remove it, and then we add a native urchin, sea urchin, to graze on the remaining fragments and keep it from growing back.
Wow. Well, you certainly have a big job out there. So you are in charge of a lot of different invasive species, and you know, just this one action, I assume, takes a lot of your time and your staff's time. So it's definitely an impact that we want to manage. I know dead coral doesn't necessarily protect us from things like storm surges, and it doesn't make good habitat for all of the different species that need to use it as habitat or food. So thank you. Right now, I'd like to ask Scott Godwin. Scott, you've been working on the issues of ballast water and biofouling for quite a while now. And I think your name is on a lot of publications for all of these surveys of different reefs and harbors around the state, and you've really documented what this issue is. So if you could explain to us a little bit about, you know, this issue of biofouling and some of the work you've done.
Sure. I mean, the biofouling is sort of an issue that's been fairly new in the marine and alien species field. Ballast water was covered quite a bit starting in the early 90s with a lot of the research that was done at the Smithsonian Institution, which I participated in as well. But biofouling is a very new thing because it's a very hard thing to quantify and survey. And so what we've done in Hawaii is basically we've developed diving protocols to survey and inventory all of these biofouling organisms that range from plants to crabs and those sort of things. So we've documented that and shown that there are things that have come in, and doing historical literature searches, we've determined that a lot of the organisms that are here already have come in mostly from biofouling over the last 100 years as opposed to ballast water.
Wow. So can you describe a little bit about what ballast water is compared to biofouling?
Well, ballast water is what ships use to balance themselves out in the ocean. So they have dedicated tanks aboard that they pump on seawater that sort of trims out the ship and allows it to ride more smoothly, or to balance out cargo loads. And Hawaii doesn't really receive a lot of ballast water because we mostly ship in cargo and we ship out ballast water. So we're actually exporting more ballast water than we bring in, as opposed to a lot of areas on the West Coast like LA that are exporting a lot of things. And so when I came here in the late 90s to begin my ballast water work, it was different than all the other ports I'd worked in, where it was very little in the way of ballast water coming in. It's not that it's not an issue, but it's not as big of an issue as the biofouling is.
Well, tell us a little bit more about biofouling then. What are the problems?
The problems are being able to quantify it, first of all, but the biggest problem is working with the shipping industry to come up with better methods for controlling it so they're not bringing in these large quantities of it. And to be honest, the shipping industry is a lot more proactive than most people think they are about biofouling, because this biofouling costs them money, because it causes their ship a lot of drag on their ships, and it costs them a lot more in fuel. So them cleaning and maintaining biofouling at a more moderate level actually saves them money in the long run.
So if ships have a clean hull, the cost of fuel and all of that, would that solve our problem?
Not necessarily. There are other areas on ships that stuff hide, and there's biofouling associated with aquarium industry imports that are either legal or not legal. And nothing ever really completely solves the problem, but we've done some pretty big efforts over the last 15 to 17 years to minimize the likelihood of new introductions, and that's where we've sort of been focusing.
Wow. Well, you have some slides you've put together. Would you like to share those with us? Thank you.
So what I want to talk about today is an introduction into what biofouling is, and look at particular organisms, life histories of them, and what makes them biofouling organisms, and how that relates to the characteristics of ships that carry them. And so I'd begin first with a brief overview of hull fouling or biofouling introductions as an issue. And so some numbers that I have are, for Hawaii, roughly 35 to 78% of the established marine alien species that are here were brought in by biofouling. And basically, if you look at Japan, the number's around 42%. And there are other areas like New Zealand that have shown that it's roughly about 69%, and in Australia about 75%. So these are recent studies that have been done that are showing that biofouling is a very important vector. So from the life history of what we call marine sessile invertebrates, so sessile is a word that means that these organisms attach to the bottom and stay in the same place their whole life. And so that sort of is the crux of what a biofouling organism is. But it's the larvae of these that allow them to either attach to the hull or disperse naturally or on man-made substrates. So basically a simplified diagram of what we're talking about is, so basically you have a community of biofouling organisms. Their larvae releases, and it settles out on a new substrate and then grows into another adult colony, and just sort of the cycle just keeps going and going. And so you can either have it come from port structure to the ship, or a ship to a port structure, or from ship to ship. So that's how these things can get transferred around in these harbors. And vessels in general are very good habitats for these type of organisms. These are organisms that naturally live either intertidally or shallow subtidally most of the time. And some of them like shade, some of them like light. And all of these different kind of habitats, vertical habitats and horizontal habitats, which are very specific to some animals, exist on commercial vessels. So this is a photo of a vessel in a dry dock, and this shows you out of the water all these different areas that can be used by all these different organisms. So you have the rudders in the very back, you have the rope guards that are attached to the props, and you have the props themselves, and this area, which I'll get to in a little bit, called keel blocks. So these are the blocks that a vessel sits on, and when they repaint the vessel, these spots don't get repainted. So stuff can actually grow there, whether they've painted the vessel or cleaned it or not. Another spot is a sea chest. This is an intake area that they use to pull in water for the ballast tanks and other sort of water systems that use salt water. And this is a recess that allows organisms to hide inside of this grated area and survive long voyages. So this is a close-up of a prop. Even though props are constantly moving, they still get a lot of organisms growing on them. And the thing I mentioned before, the sea chest, this is a grate of one of them. You can see all of the organisms growing on it right now. So to further move on, I'll focus a little more on the influence of the ship hulls have on this marine growth. So characteristics of ships, the characteristics of the source ports that these vessels are coming from, and the biology of fouling organisms. So the characteristics of ships are that they have hull coatings on them that are made to keep this biofouling from growing on them. And before about 2003, they used to use this substance called tributyl-10, which is very toxic and would keep most things from growing on the hull, but it was banned by the International Maritime Organization because it's highly toxic to the marine environment. Now most of the paints are copper-based, which is still toxic to the environment, but not as much as tributyl-10. And so it slowly releases from these paints to keep things from settling on it if the ships are moving quite a bit and the paints are newer. So the issue is if the ships are not moving very much, the paints are ineffective, and if basically the paints are older, they're ineffective. And that's what I'm showing here. So in this slide, I'm showing that anti-fouling paints work, but they have to be put on more regularly than most vessel operators do them. They usually have longer periods of time than they should just to save money because it's extremely expensive. And there are areas that I mentioned before, the keel blocks, that are devoid of this paint, which allow things to grow on the vessel hull. And also, the wear of the anti-fouling paints is different in different parts of the ship. Some areas get a lot more turbulence from the water, or get roughed up by things they run over in the sea, and that wears the paints off. So this is an image under a ship. On your right side is a typical biofouling community, and right next to it is a completely brand new cleaned hull. This spot where the vessel hull fouling is growing is a spot where the keel blocks were when it was sitting in the dry dock. So it didn't get repainted, it didn't get cleaned, and the fouling still continues to grow. And this is another issue. We were talking before about horizontal and vertical surfaces. Some organisms really grow well on these horizontal surfaces on ships. This is an image of a vessel hull with barnacles growing above the waterline. And this is a species of barnacle that we have here in Hawaii that likes to grow above the waterline, and it's not native here. And so they grow very readily on the hulls of ships out of the water. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is the characteristics of ports in general and why they allow this sort of thing to happen. So ports can be enclosed like this diagram, and they have sort of closed patterns of circulation in them. And these closed ports as opposed to an open port, so image this port without that outside seawall. And this graph shows that the growth of organisms within enclosed ports are much greater than open ports. And that's the reason this stuff really grows on the vessel hulls really well, despite the hull fouling paints and all that, because there's this big community of established adults that are producing all that larvae that we talked about before that are attaching to these hulls. So the port designs and the way they are allow all this sort of cycle to happen. So this is an image of some settlement plates that were put into an open port and an enclosed port and left in the water for the exact same time. And so you can see on an open port, much less stuff has settled out on this plate, and the plate on the right is covered with all sorts of stuff. And that's because it was in an enclosed port. And the next thing I'd really like to talk about is the sort of the dynamics of these sessile organisms, or these organisms that don't move. And I'm using an example here of this animal. It's called a bryozoan, and this particular one's called Watercipera. It is highly copper tolerant and will settle out immediately on freshly painted hulls if the vessel is not moving for, say, more 2 or 3 weeks at a time. And it also allows other things to grow on it. So this, as it shows in this image, these round circles are the bryozoan growing there, and it's allowing an alien seaweed to actually grow on top of that. And you see all the blue around that image is the clean vessel hull that was cleaned recently. And so despite our best efforts, as you asked before, of keeping everything out, there's always going to be some stuff that's going to make it and come in. And this is an image of a freshly cleaned hull that's within 3 or 4 weeks, and this is another bryozoan just growing on the hull on this fresh paint. That's because it's very copper tolerant. So in summary, what I've been talking about is marine fouling will eventually occur on any surface that's left in the ocean environment. And ship hulls provide a really great environment for these type of organisms to grow and be transported to these port systems. And finally, that the nature and extent of fouling depends on factors associated with the ships themselves, so their anti-fouling paints and their activity rates, and the port environment, as I showed before, these enclosed ports and the way they're designed, and the biology of these organisms, like the one I mentioned before, that's super copper tolerant, that can overcome our best efforts to keep things from growing on vessel hulls.
Wow. Well, thank you for that. That was certainly Biofouling 101. You know, I just a couple of questions. It seems that, you know, we're lacking in some technologies to clean the hulls and keep these things from growing. Certainly, we're trying to play catch up with hull fouling, hull paints, and just trying to find a good middle ground there, something that doesn't allow things to grow and is safe enough for the environment. Are there advances in that area?
There's a lot of money in the industry that goes into this. Since the tributyl tins were banned by the International Maritime Organization, that was the best tool, but it's highly toxic to the marine environment. So marine engineers have been working on coatings that are more silicon-based and have less biocides in them. But overall, the best paints that they make are called ablative paints. And they're a paint that goes on, and it's essentially these sandwiched layers of paint that slough off as the vessel moves. These micro layers of it slough off and keeps re-exposing a fresher coat with biocides in it. And so that's the reason if vessels are constantly moving all the time, they're going to have very little fouling. But a vessel with that kind of paint on it, if it sits for a long period of time, it's going to get fouling no matter what, whether the paint's new or old. And so there's a lot of effort because, as I stated before, there's a lot of money involved with fuel savings and those sort of things in the industry.
What about areas like, you know, you mentioned the sea chest with the grating over it. I remember seeing a picture at one point where there was a grating and there was fouling all through it, and then there was a beautiful fish, like a aquarium on the bottom of a vessel. Do those paints work in that area, or how do they not work?
Well, it's a problem area from the standpoint of alien species transport, but it's also a problem area for the vessels because when all these organisms get in there, this is where they get their cooling water for their engines, comes in through these sea chests. And so, but the only way to clean them out is when the vessels are in dry dock because you can't take the grates off in water. And so what the industry has been doing is coming up with these sort of biocidal blocks within these sea chests that sort of create a bad environment for stuff to settle out. And that's still very in experimental stage right now. So a lot of it is physical cleaning by divers who are basically using like power washers underwater to like try to get up in there and just blast stuff out. And so it's just one of the many things that the industry fights with for fuel savings and maintenance. And we luck out because in a lot of ways it helps prevent, you know, a lot of the transfer of these marine alien species.
And so, you know, there's going to be folks out there, and I'm sure some of our watchers, our viewers, are thinking, well, can't you just pull the ship into like a freshwater environment or somewhere that might kill these species? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, most of our ports are in temperate, estuarine, or saltwater areas. There's not very many ports, especially on the West Coast and the tropical Pacific, that are in areas that are completely fresh. And so, and a lot of these areas that are freshwater ports are not deep water ports. And the dynamic of where most of the things come from for cargo for Hawaii are from these areas that are saltwater ports. And so, being able to do, you could probably do that in single case scenarios, but for the industry overall, it's pretty impractical to try to expect that sort of thing.
Yeah, from what I was reading about, you know, I have seen instances where, you know, marine invertebrates, when they are threatened, like they think they're not going to survive temperature change or salinity change, they immediately spawn. Is that is that the case? Or?
Yeah, it happens not regularly, but a lot of times when vessels are passing, like say through the Panama Canal, that's one of the protections from stuff from the Caribbean. If they're coming through the Panama Canals, the freshwater rinse through there will kill a lot of things, but it also allows them to introduce a lot of stuff into the Panama Canal or on the Pacific side of the Panama Canal as stuff is coming out. It tends to cause stress, and they tend to start releasing all those larvae and stuff, just you know, because that's just what's happening under their stress situations.
Wow, sounds like a pretty major problem. So, are there other? So, again, for those keel blocks, how would we? I mean, can we just go scrape those off, or what do we do with those?
Well, that ends up being an in-water cleaning issue, because vessels, if they don't clean those off, they just get all this fouling growing on them. And so there's no way to, the only way to basically paint a keel block area is they would have to wait till the paint dries that they've put on, refloat the vessel, and then move it forward enough to like stagger the keel blocks, and we're talking millions of dollars every time they do that kind of operation. And so it's just not cost effective for the industry to do those sort of things. The Navy might be one of the few that actually does that for things like submarines and their warships that need the speed, you know, without being dragged down by that stuff. But overall, basically they have to maintain those keel block areas with in-water cleanings by commercial divers.
Wow, well, thank you very much. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. When we come back, we're going to learn a little bit about what some other places in the world are doing about this issue. You're watching Line in the Sand. Thanks for staying with us. You're watching Line in the Sand, and we're talking about the issue of biofouling. It is one of those wicked problems where there are so many things going on that it's really hard to solve it. And so what I'd like to do is ask Kevin a little bit about your work. You know, you've looked around and worked with a lot of different folks in different areas. And, you know, sometimes it's best for us to learn from following. And so in your work, what have you learned from other places? What's everybody else doing?
Well, Christy, as Scott mentioned earlier, biofouling is the new kid on the block. We've been used to ballast water as being the primary source of aquatic invasive species, and now that it's being studied more, people are realizing that biofouling is just as big, if not more of a problem than ballast water itself. So some countries and states have taken the lead on this. I mean, if you look at New Zealand, which has a great holistic biosecurity program, they're very ahead of the curve. In 2014, they implemented biofouling regulations where vessels coming from out of state would need to go through a vessel check process, possibly in-water cleaning, as Scott mentioned, and going through these certain processes to really make sure that these vessels are coming in clean and not bringing any of the critters or any of the stuff that they don't want there into their waters. Australia is also in the process of creating some regulations to implement a similar program. And actually, California, in July 2016, will be rolling out with a set of regulations. This will be the first mandatory set of regulations anywhere in the world that would implement a biofouling program. So this is something that's on the radar, and it's starting to become, you're starting to see legislation, whether it's in different countries or whether it's in the United States itself. And I think Hawaii is a place where it would be very ripe. I mean, we have an environment that is a fragile ecosystem, and we have, I think, the 300 plus introduced species. So we are in the process, I believe, or the state at least is in the process of evaluating options, waiting for the science to come together, because the science is kind of how policy will be determined. And in the future, biofouling regulations are in the path.
So, you know, when you look at New Zealand, we always hold up New Zealand as this great conservation example. If we could just do it like New Zealand, there's a lot of reasons why we can't just simply, you know, impose our own rules and regulations and have that apply to international or, you know, commerce. But we can learn a few things from them. And if you can explain a little bit about sort of the background and all of the things that, or some of the things that New Zealand had to do to be able to come up with these, this regulation. It's not something that just popped up.
Sure. One big process that's involved anytime you are creating policy is creating a risk assessment, trying to determine what vessels coming in are going to be higher risk. For example, the vessels coming out of state are a much higher risk than in Hawaii inter-island vessels. That's because you're dealing with stuff that's never been introduced here. So risk assessments look at where the vessel's coming from, the type of vessel itself. Scott mentioned these ablative paints. So the anti-fouling coating that these vessels have is a big consideration in determining risk. The climate, I mean, the environment. If something's coming from the South Pacific, any organisms are more likely to survive in our waters versus a vessel coming from Alaska or something. So a risk assessment is a big first step in determining you know, where these programs came from. And New Zealand, as you pointed out, did a great job of creating a risk assessment. And that's what is being done right now with their interim rules. And when they have all the information they need and the country can make an informed decision, that's when they'll go ahead and the regulations will become mandatory.
Wow. And so how is California moving ahead then? Have they done a similar process?
Yeah, so California since the mid 2010, I think, have actually created mandatory biofouling reporting. Mm-hmm. So I believe it was 90% of vessels had to fill out this form that explained the coating that they have, record keeping, other various ways that they've tracked these vessels and their practices for several years to see how they manage biofouling, how often they clean, how well they clean, the process that they use. And so they've been able to gather this information and turn it into practices that are effective, but at the same time aren't going to hamper the industry or make it difficult for commerce to proceed. Hawaii, you know, we rely on these container ships bringing stuff in, so it needs to be reasonable, but we also need to create a system where we're stopping most of the invasive species that are coming in.
Yeah. So, you know, one would think that if California sets in place regulations, then we'll be better off. You know, we get a lot of things from there. Is that correct, or do we still need to be doing things on our end?
That's correct to a certain degree. I mean, if they're upholding regulations in California and they have clean vessels coming in, then you would think that they'd also have clean vessels coming out. But you know, it's not just the West Coast that we get shipping from. We get stuff from Washington, from Oregon, also the North Pacific, other places in the North Pacific, as well as Asia. So I think California is setting a precedent right now for the rest of the world to eventually follow and kind of mimic. And if the program works, then it's creating a perfect model for everybody else to follow.
Wow. And so what is, do we have the legal authority to be able to put rules in place? I mean, California is certainly moving ahead. Do we have that authority here in Hawaii?
Yes, actually, in Hawaii we have HRS 187A-32, and it's a broad statute, but it basically designates the Department of Land and Natural Resources as the lead agency on preventing the introduction of aquatic invasive species through both whole ballast water introductions as well as whole fouling. So we have an authorizing statute in place. But what we really need are rules, administrative rules to go along with that statute.
Yeah. And so, if we were to follow everyone else's model, we need to be doing these risk assessments, and we need to start working with stakeholders and assessing what they do. Are we starting that? Have we done some of that yet?
Yeah, so we have done that. Just recently in 2014, a Hawaii biofouling report looked at some of the management processes that go on in Hawaii. So we're starting to do it now. It's not something that you can do overnight. It's a process, and we've had a lot of the industry very helpful in providing information to us, and we just need to keep the momentum going and collecting information as we go, and eventually put it all together and have a policy that makes sense.
Yeah. It sounds like one of the big needs beyond just having the risk assessments, but it's having the tools to be able to have a clean ship and to clean your hulls and to have that available in multiple ports. So wherever they are, they may be able to clean. And so, are there needs for Hawaii to improve on this, or can we again copy from other people? Can we do that?
I think I think we definitely are going to need some type of consistency between what California does, what the eventual West Coast states do. Consistency is key, and information gathering is key. So the next coming years are going to be filled with data gathering, finding out the practices, but at the same time, the result is going to have to be something that looks pretty close to what California is doing right now. Yeah. And eventually, on the bigger scale, internationally there's going to be an international convention or some type of agreement between countries as to how to manage and regulate biofouling.
Mm-hmm. Do we have a similar convention or agreement for other? I mean, the seas connect us. They not only keep us apart. Really, in this sense, when you have ships going between countries, you really do need something at the international level to manage the transfer of species, or maybe even, just thinking about it more holistically, the movement of goods or pollution or any of these things. So are there such conventions that exist for management?
A great example is the Ballast Water Convention created in 2004 in conjunction with the International Maritime Organization. So in the early 90s, ballast water became a really big issue. It was zebra mussels were introduced to the Great Lake area. They were clogging up water pipes. I think they've estimated that the damage alone in the area has been $5 billion. Wow. So no small drop in the hat. And as a result of this, the zebra mussel, which eventually was found to be originating from ballast water, so vessels that would traverse from the ocean to the Great Lakes were dumping their ballast water in, and that's how eventually the zebra mussels colonized the area. And so all this legislation came out as a result of the zebra mussel itself. Thank you, zebra mussel. And so in the early 90s, the national, what became the National Invasive Species Act, a federal legislation that allowed both the Coast Guard and, that created, that designated the Coast Guard as the lead agency to create ballast water rules, was formed. Under the Clean Water Act, the EPA also regulates vessel discharges. So ballast water is a prime example of how at both the international level, the federal level, and even at the state level, well-developed regulations were created.
Wow. And so our hope, I think you're saying, is that we could follow this path for biofouling.
That's exactly what I'm saying. Ideally, as often as we don't like to hear, sometimes emergencies like the zebra mussel are where it push that need. So biofouling, the need is there, and hopefully it can follow the same path as the way that we've regulated ballast water.
Wow. Thanks for your work on this. We're going to take a short break. You're watching Line in the Sand, and we're talking about biofouling today. Stay with us. You're watching Line in the Sand, and we're talking about biofouling. We're going to hear now from the Ballast and Hull Fouling or Biofouling Coordinator, Jules. Jules, this is your whole project. This is what you are hired to do. So can you tell us a little bit about what it is you're doing to address this problem in Hawaii?
Yeah, so I'm going to split my answer into two parts. The first part's going to be about ballast water, and there's a couple of things that we're trying to do with this issue. The first one is that we have ballast water rules. They were they were implemented in 2007, but there are a couple of things that are outdated now in certain sections that are not in line with federal regulations, the U.S. Coast Guard regulations. So that's something that we want to improve and to amend. So those ballast water rules is something that I'm going to be working on with other folks. The second thing for ballast water is we want to proactively figure out which, if any, ships with ballast water are not compliant. So right now, we have the legal authority to go on vessels to collect water samples and to collect sediment, as well as do any sort of inquiries or ask any questions that we may have regarding the ballast water. But we haven't done any of that, any sort of compliance testing. So that's something that I want to build, a program for essentially arriving onto vessels with the help of the U.S. Coast Guard to test the ballast water for viability or living stuff, so to speak.
So you basically, we've got this rule and we've got reporting and we've got measures that are being taken, but you don't know if it's actually working or not, if it's reducing the risk. And that's kind of what you want to do a baseline for?
That's right. We kind of want to do just a check to see if the vessels that are reporting their ballast water and activities on are compliant.
Yeah.
And to work with the vessel owners or ship operators to get them in compliance if they aren't.
Yeah. Thank you.
And then actually, to continue with that, part of the Being Proactive program is we want to do rapid assessments of this ballast water. Because right now we have techniques that take a long time, such as getting very well-trained science technicians to observe organisms under the microscope. That takes many, many hours and lots of training. So we want to simplify that process and use what's called a rapid compliance assessment tool. So that's also in the needing to be developed area of this process. And then thirdly, I would like to develop a plan B, like a contingency plan, where if a vessel does come in and their ballast water is not compliant and they were unable to treat it or do a mid-ocean exchange, then we'd want to figure out a protocol to basically treat that water, whether it's with a UV system or adding chlorine into it, and of course neutralizing it prior to its being discharged. But we want to have a plan B essentially for the non-compliant water that comes in. And then so the second part of my answer, which is regarding biofouling, is that, as Kevin said, we don't have any biofouling rules right now. And on the slide, you can see that to the right side, there's a whole bunch of a list of 8 citations where there's quite a bit of information that we can draw off of to develop these reasonable biofouling rules. On top of that, we would like to include stakeholders such as other government agencies locally, such as Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, U.S. Coast Guard, Navy. We would like everyone to be involved so that we do come up with biofouling rules that are reasonable and make everyone happy, essentially, while still protecting the state of Hawaii. And on top of that, we would also like to include a recommendation for the best biofouling management practices. So how often you should clean your hull or dry dock, or how often you should put this sort of biofouling prevention paint on that idea. And lastly, to include also a whole husbandry form. And what that means is a questionnaire to identify where the ship last came from, like if they came from Panama Canal, or if they came from Alaska. We want to allocate our efforts towards the higher risk vessels or yachts or boats that come in, so that we're not just spread thin across the board, because there's no way for us to evaluate every single boat that comes in. So we want to put forth our effort to the ships and vessels that are higher risk. And then, so that was for developing biofouling rules. The next item that I was wanting to put together is the proactive measure of inspecting boats. So as I had mentioned before, we want to inspect hulls, niche areas such as propellers, the thrusters, those areas where it's harder to clean, to identify, again, which vessels are most at risk. So we want to put forth a pilot study where we don't tag anyone or give anyone fines, because right now we still don't have biofouling rules. But we want to do a risk assessment to make sure that we're putting forth our efforts towards these higher risk vessels. A reactive program that I'd like to put together, again, similar to the ballast water, is Plan B. What are we going to do if a ship is 8 inches thick in biofouling? Are we going to just scrape all that stuff off and have it fall into the ocean, or do we want to catch it with some sort of system and multiple filters thereafter, so that these organisms that get scraped off don't get released into the waters? So Plan B was one of them. And then lastly, monitoring. So we want to corroborate potential settlement plates that we'd put into the different harbors to look for any sort of recruitment of invasives, newly arrived invasives that come over, so that we can, as I was saying before, collaborate or corroborate the data from our hull fouling inspections to these assessment plates, essentially. And in the slide you can see in the picture, that's me tying some settlement plates onto the bottom of a dock in the He'eia harbor. And then to the right of it is a plate that's completely fouled with organisms, including algae and tunicates and sponges. Yeah.
Well, that sounds like no small amount of work that you've got planned. And I know you can't do this alone, and I know you've got great colleagues to help. And but we also know that we need a lot of cooperation and understanding from stakeholders. Are you planning on really reaching out to them, or how has that been going so far?
Yeah, so I have reached out to several different groups, and I'm trying to get everyone together to be a part of this task force that's called the Aquatic Alien Organism Task Force. And
We're
it
gonna
involves,
short name.
yeah, just a mouthful. But it involves a conglomeration of folks, because as I said before, we really need just everyone's input, including the Department of Health, Agriculture, U.S. Coast Guard, even the in-water cleaning systems companies that we have on the island or on the other islands, ship operators, agents, just everyone to get their input because they all matter. They're all stakeholders in this big issue that we have.
Yeah. Well, and the issue, as was stated earlier, hundreds of species have arrived. And when you consider sort of the terrestrial environment, I think, plants alone are probably, 10,000 new plants in Hawaii. So I think for the marine environment, it's at a very early stage or slower stage of invasion. But, we can just look to the terrestrial, the land habitats and see that if we don't do some things, then we're going to be in a place that perhaps we don't want to be living in anymore. And so thank you for your work. I appreciate it. We're going to take just a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to find out what we as the community can do to help address this issue and be part of the solution. Stay with us. We are still talking about biofouling. We're at the point in our program where we hear a little bit about what we can do as a community to help protect Hawaii. So, I don't own a ship, nor do I own a vessel. And so I feel like, in a lot of ways, maybe we don't have a lot to do. What can the average person do, Brian?
So this is a huge problem, so we need all the help we can get. And one of the biggest things that the average citizen can do is be on the lookout for anything that doesn't look native or that you haven't seen before. So especially if you're a diver, a fisher, snorkeler, if you see something, please report it to DLNR or the Eyes of the Reef Network. And if you're interested in getting in a little bit deeper and actually getting trained to identify reef threats, you can get in touch with Eyes of the Reef, that's EOR.org, and they'll actually train you how to identify these threats, how to document them, and report them.
Mm-hmm. Wow, okay, so we can deputize ourselves. That's awesome. What are some of the other things that we can do for Scott? Do you have any suggestions?
Well, it's a lot of simple things because people are so connected to the nearshore environment here, and parents will take their children out to collect things, and it's just one of the simplest things to do to sort of prevent spread of things or sort of impacts is to just not drag stuff to different locations inter-island or within the island because most people don't think about that, moving things around, but a lot of these things might have been at small stages on like a shell of a hermit crab or something like that. And if it's already here, but sometimes stuff gets spread by human activities a lot more, and it's kind of activities that most people would not think about.
Yeah. So you clean your gear between spots?
Yeah, so fishing, if you're like netting, anything that you're doing that stuff's in the water so that you don't transport algae and other organisms that are found in these nearshore environments or in the deeper reef environments.
Yeah, okay, well, good tips. How about Kevin, do you have any tips? How about for actual biofouling? What should people be doing?
So for all the lucky boat owners out there, there's a couple things that they can do to try and stop the spread. The first would be to inspect your boat regularly, see what's growing on there, and if there is something growing, clean your boat on a regular basis. So first thing you want to do, ideally, is to anytime you clean your boat is to get it out on dry dock and do it. That way, anything that gets scraped off, anytime you take your boat out on its trailer, you can scrape stuff off, throw it in the trash, make sure it doesn't get back to the ocean. Mm-hmm. Also, what you want to do is, if you're going to clean your boat, clean it on a regular basis so nothing larger than that layer of slime grows. You want to make sure that it's easy for you to clean and that nothing larger than that is growing. However, if you do have to clean while in the water, clean where your boat normally is. If you don't have a trailer, if you're docked somewhere, clean there, clean at that harbor, so then you're not taking anything to a location that doesn't have anything. And that would be the third thing, is to ensure whenever you are going somewhere else, if you're going to a neighbor island, if you're going to the mainland, If you have a really big boat that you want to take around the world, make sure you're cleaning your boat wherever you go to ensure that the stuff that you catch there or that you pick up there stays there.
Yeah. All right. And any last tips, Jules? Any?
Yeah, so if you have any aquarium pets or any pets in general that hang out in saltwater, please don't dump them in the ocean. They could get out and reproduce and then become another introduced invasive species, and that could be a problem, definitely. So please don't dump your organisms in the ocean. Euthanize it humanely, give it to a pet shop, but yes, keep it away from the ocean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think that goes for all fish tank creatures and pets as well. We want to try not to, we want to be humane to them and return them so that they can get rehomed. We are just about out of time, and I'd like to thank my panelists for being here. Thank you for your expertise and being willing to share it. I also want to thank the Leeward Community College Educational Media Center for your help filming this program, and the Hawaii Invasive Species Council for funding it. Thank you also to the viewer for spending time with us. Stay tuned for more programs with Line in the Sand. We're talking about coconut rhinoceros beetles, little fire ants, and rapid ohia death. So come back and watch these programs again. Thank you for your time. Aloha.